Hi, good afternoon everyone. We're live at Holborn at the Unite head office. Welcome to this afternoon's Facebook Live session on the NHS pension scheme. We are running today's session because we've had lots of contacts from members asking for information both on the scheme in general but also on specific questions that people have. I'm Dave Munday, Lead Professional Officer with the Unite Union in the health sector, but you're not going to see much of me today. What I do want to say to you is if you've got any questions, either now or from something that's triggered from the discussion that we're having this afternoon, then there's three ways that you can ask them. The first one is you can put a comment on the Facebook Live stream. The second is that you can email me at dave.munday@uniteunion.org. Don't worry if you've not got that, it's on the Facebook Live stream as well, because it's written down. And you can also tweet us, but make sure that you include in the Twitter comment at unite_MHNA. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the two chairs of this afternoon's session. We've got Terry and Jonathan, and they're going to be Phil and Holly for today's session.
Do you want to introduce yourself first?
My name's Terry Roth. I'm a Unite companion and a clinical psychologist, and I have had quite a lot to do with pensions, particularly on behalf of women who were part-time workers over the years.
My name's Jonathan Slater. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and I'm here really to better understand the different pension schemes and what they might mean, but also to ask questions to John on behalf of members.
I'm John Neal, I'm Unite's Pensions Officer. I sit on the National Health Scheme Pension Scheme as Unite's representative on the Scheme Advisory Board and various other public sector schemes.
Shall we crack off with a question?
Yeah, why not?
Should I do one? So it doesn't say from whom, but it says, hi there. I was given a second option during the choice exercise when the 2015 scheme was brought in. This was because I just missed out on MH officer status and due to my age had no protection in 1995 scheme. I changed my 1995 benefit to the 2008 scheme to give me the option of drawdown after I was aged 55, so I'll have 20 years as of 2015 in the 2008 scheme and the rest in the 2015 scheme, i.e. currently 4 years. Please can you tell me what pot or pots I can draw down on and how this is calculated? For example, if at age 55 I draw down 50% of the pot.
Okay, the first thing to say with regards to drawdown for public sector schemes is in general there is no drawdown option. When the pension freedoms came in with the change of legislation, the government ruled out that public sector workers would not have the option to be able to do drawdown. And what drawdown is when you have a defined benefit, you can basically take a transfer out of that and put that into a different vehicle, either a defined contribution or via lump sums, and you can have different options in order to get out your money in different ways. However, that is the only option where it is available in the way that Terry has highlighted, because a member was going to be denied further access to mental health officer status. They were given a one-off option in order to be able to draw down. So to specifically ask the questions, yes, they will be able to draw down against both pots. So it's not that they can just have the one beyond the later date. They will be able to draw down across both pots. I don't know the precise calculations with regards to each individual section. Obviously we can get the member that information. They have options. I think they can draw down twice a year as well within that, and there's certain other restrictions, but hopefully that will be enough for now. And I've seen a similar question to that already, so I'm sure I'll be able to follow up and give any more information, particularly on the calculations part of that.
I think there's a couple of PDFs that are available as
There is, a general guidance specifically with regards to the drawdown option. So we can supply the member with that.
I want to start with a slightly simpler question, if that's okay. Just because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's been so many different schemes since and before 1995. So, what exactly is the NHS pension scheme?
Yep. I'll try and keep this as brief as I can. So when you want me to move on, just wave your hand in the air or something. So, well, it's a defined benefit scheme. So what is a defined benefit scheme? It is what it says it is. It's a defined benefit in terms of the member will be guaranteed a defined actual pensionable amount when they reach retirement. The other sort of type of pension that's out there is a defined contribution pension, which again is what it says it is in terms of the contribution. What goes in is defined. However, what comes out is not guaranteed because we don't know. So that's just a general description of the differences in pension schemes.
The NHS is defined.
And the NHS is a defined benefit scheme, which is, we would say, the better scheme because it is guaranteed, and they're schemes that we want to fight for and schemes that we want to keep, not just across the public sector but also across the private sector within that as well. Now there's different types of defined benefit scheme, and they are a final salary scheme or a career average scheme. A care scheme is a career average revalued evaluation scheme. Excuse me. So what is the difference between those two? Again, it's in the words. Final salary in terms of the salary as people progress through their careers, their pay normally goes up, and it's at that point, at the highest point, that your pension will be based on. When schemes have gone through changes and employers have looked to make savings and reductions because schemes have entered difficulties, they have changed them from final salary to care career average schemes, which are still very, very good schemes and are still defined benefit, but as it says in the words, that the pension will be based on your career average performance rather than your final salary, i.e. it will be less, which means it will be cheaper for the employer and it won't be as good as a pension as a final salary scheme would be. However, it still will be a very good pension that will be guaranteed. There's another little element, and then I'll probably be quiet in case you want to follow up with some other questions with regards to that, particularly in the NHS and public sector really. It's been through changes via the Hutton report when they changed from final salary schemes to career average schemes in the public sector. What's been the change since then? The key thing for a career average scheme is the rate of accrual and also the revaluation rate. Now, the revaluation rate, depending on what that is, if your pay awards are not higher than the revaluation rate, then in effect you're still in the final salary scheme because your final salary will not be deviating from the career average, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, for instance, if you only got a pay freeze, which isn't a pay rise, as we know, or 1%. There's been some very, strong constraints from government in recent years with regards to those sort of things, but your revaluation rate was higher, 1.5%, 2%, 2.5%, you wouldn't be in a worse position at the outset. Obviously, over a longer period, and the reason an employer would do that is over the long term they can see some sort of savings. Now, you could argue about what they are. It may be somewhere in the region of 10%, all depends how long you've got to go in your career. And the other major thing with regards to that is it all depends on what sort of career progression you make, because you can lose out in a career average scheme if you do make obviously career progression at the later end of your career, which in a way a final salary scheme would have rewarded that one far more.
Okay. I guess for me there's a number of pension schemes, NHS ones that people bandy about. There's the kind of mental health officer status, there's the 1995, there's the 2008,
yep.
There's the 2015.
Yep.
Is it possible to
give some context? Yeah, so let's try to put it into context, a lot of what I've just been saying there then. So let's focus on, as you say, the 95, the 98, and then the 2015 scheme. Sorry, the 95, 2008 and the 2015 scheme. So the difference is in terms of 95, 2008 final salary schemes. 2015 career average scheme. And that came about again at this point when Hutton did a report. The government then forced through changes to all public sector schemes where they were downgraded in effect, but still very, very good schemes. And that's when the change happened. The major difference between the 95 and the 2008 will be the retirement age, again, when governments were looking at and there was a lot of pressure in terms of to again devalue public sector schemes. They tinker around the edges and they make adjustments what are worse for the members, but save money in terms of making sure they keep the schemes affordable, as they refer to them. So that is a very quick description of the differences. But the important thing to realise is that they are still very, very good schemes and very well, still worth fighting for, particularly in comparison to defined contribution schemes.
And I guess kind of final question in that area, in terms of those different schemes, were people kind of forced over from one into the next? So for example, people that didn't pick up the 2008 scheme seem to have been forced into the 2015 scheme, and I'm not clear about whether those that did opt into the 2008 were then subsequently forced into the 2015 anyway.
What was put in place was meant to transition a lot of people to take away, which could be quite a big step change, particularly for members, workers in the later stage of their career. So they put forms of protection and tapered protection in place. Now, full protection is what it said it was. If a member was of a certain age, very close to retirement, they would leave as was. Tapered protection is as it sounds. It would be tapered out from a longer age range, that you would remain in the final salary scheme. However, when you got to a certain age, you would then move over to the career average scheme, so you didn't have full protection. Others didn't have that protection and were immediately placed in the future career average scheme, which has led to other questions and things going on, which we'll probably get to, but that probably gives context.
This is one of the hot issues, isn't it?
It certainly is, yeah.
Would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
Right, where should I start with this then?
We've got a question on it, haven't we? That you're holding.
Yeah, I think it's just trying to work out where to start in terms of giving full context in terms of when changes happened in 2015, moving from final salary to career averages. A cost cap mechanism was put in place, which was that if public sector schemes exceeded a 2% cap, then we'd have to sit down and talk with regards to look at adjusting benefit levels, perhaps increasing contribution levels in order to maintain the scheme.
What does that mean, if you mind me asking? A cap on what?
In terms of the costs that are needed to run the pension scheme. So all pension schemes go through valuations. Most private sector schemes every 3 years, public sector schemes like the NHS every 4 years. The NHS is a bit different in terms of it's an unfunded scheme. What that means is it isn't a pension scheme that is really invested like a funded scheme is, all the ones in the private sector, and the local government pension scheme is actually a funded scheme. So the money that goes in investments, shares, bonds, etc., and is run as a normal pension scheme would be. The NHS pension scheme isn't run like that. It's an unfunded scheme. However,
simpler, isn't it?
It is. However, the government, via what happened in 2015, have adopted a policy, if you like, of applying the same rules to that pension scheme, which in itself is debatable as far as we're concerned, because they're very fixated on getting the income in, if you like, if you refer to it in that way, the contributions in order to cover what is going out, which is sensible and normal. However, they're applying a valuation basis by that in terms of things called a discount rate, which is the key assumption in valuations, and that predicts how much investment performance you will get on your returns. However, this money isn't invested in the same way, so they're applying different rules to a scheme that doesn't really run by those rules, which makes it complicated, and something that certainly from a trade union side we have great arguments and debates about, well, whether that is fair to be doing that and running it by those same rules. So I appreciate that we've got a little bit off.
It's been good to unpack.
It's important to unpack it in context, and the reason why I'm starting here is because I just want to get the flow of that. But if you'd rather me move on to something else and just shout.
No,
So in terms of the rules, how it was drawn up, it was right. 2015 they've made the changes. If it exceeds this level that they've put a valuation basis in by 2%, then you'd have to look to reduce benefits, increase contributions to cover that off. If it's below 2% and it isn't costing as much as that, the reverse would be true in terms of members would be due benefit improvements.
Yeah.
And the first time this cycle was run, what it is shown as is that the costs of running the scheme are not as expensive as they thought they were, and they are below 2%, actually around about 3.1%, which means for quite a long period of time, me as a representative of Unite, other colleagues as representatives of other trade unions have been meeting with the employers and also Department of Health and the NHS to discuss what benefit improvements we would like for our members. Yeah. It's taken up a lot of time, and we got to some good principles, and we were putting those principles to government in order for them to consider and hopefully adopt. However, a few things happened. The first thing that happened whilst that process was going on is the government brought forward a review of the valuation process in order to change the discount rate and to lower the discount rate. What lowering the discount rate will do is make future valuations and the cost of pension schemes a lot more expensive. Now, one way of looking at that was that perhaps the government felt they were embarrassed in terms of where this reform of the public sector schemes had come back, and they felt that they needed to respond. So they brought a review that wasn't due until 2021 forward straight away, and saying that from now on they would adopt a different discount rate. So before any member benefit improvements had been agreed and implemented, there already a technique was put in place to perhaps take them back another point further down the line. So that's the first part of the story, the second part of the story, and the third part of the story is finally to get to your question. The third part of the story was during the process when pensions were being moved from final salary to career average in 2015, the fire service, represented by the FBU, and also the judiciary disagreed with the approach that was being adopted and legally challenged some of the elements of what happened in 2015 on grounds of age discrimination legislation. And putting it very simply, the age discrimination legislation they were querying was based on, in many pension schemes, what you see is a form of age discrimination that can be objectively justified. That is the legal term. And the theory around it is, what a lot of this is based on, is that when changes are made, older workers have less time to adjust to the changes, moving from a better to a more detrimental pension. So the theory was that they could be protected in some way, and what we've seen in a lot of public sector schemes, some would stay in with full protection, some would have tapered protection which we gradually phased out, and others wouldn't, depending on their age. Now
as if you were within 10 years of retirement at one point, wasn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And from a younger worker's point of view, or from the FBU and the fire workers case, and also the judiciary, they disagreed with that and put arguments to say, well, surely that's the other way around. Surely the younger workers haven't had the opportunity in the years to accrue as much within that pension scheme, and they're going to be the ones that are in the worst position with regards to this. So that is the really sort of simplistic explanation of what that's all about. Now, for years, pension schemes have been able to objectively justify in the way that I laid out in terms of older workers have less time to adapt, so for that they can have some sort of benefits in terms of full protection, taper protection, or some other ways of transitional agreements to compensate in some way. This is now all thrown into the air because of a legal ruling that has said that that is now against age discrimination legislation. So what's happened now is the government has halted the public sector scheme valuation processes, so the rectification processes and the benefits that we were working on, not just in the NHS but across all public sector schemes, so the local government pension scheme and also the civil service scheme, until their appeal is either accepted or heard.
My understanding is they're at the very last stage of that, and it's gone to Supreme Court. Is that right?
The government's at the start of the stages in many ways, but what you're referring to is they haven't got very far to go in terms of that's why it would be at the Supreme Court level from a legal perspective in terms of the courts. So the government has appealed, have put in an application to appeal that decision that is saying that those changes are against age discrimination legislation. Okay. As we stand today, we are still waiting to find out whether the government will be appeal will be heard, so will even be accepted. If it, I won't run through too much forward and end up. Yeah. But if the government's appeal is granted, so they will be allowed to take it to court in order to appeal it. So they're just asking the question at the moment. If it is, then there'll be a day in court. Well, that will be considered one way or another. I'll stop at that point because I feel you want to say something.
So within that regard, if I've understood it correct, certain changes made to NHS pensions, public sector pensions over the years have resulted in, I guess unfairly, some people that are closer towards retirement needing adjustments in order to adapt, and they've usually kind of been accepted. But moving over to the 2015 pension was deemed kind of unfair to do that on the basis of age discrimination, and that's gone to the various courts. It's gone up to the Supreme Court, and it's waiting to see whether the government's appeal against that will be heard. If the government fails in that appeal, what will it actually mean for members?
Well, the first thing is that appeal relates to the firefighters and the judiciary. But the government has halted the process across all public sector schemes because it's the same changes that have been made in many ways. Although in the firefighters it's a particular type of occupation, so there's a particular relevance to the retirement age. So you've always got to be very careful in terms of legally drawing over the same conclusions at times. However, I think the government accepts that in the main that if they are unsuccessful in their appeal, that they will more than likely have to implement changes across the board, across all public sector schemes.
What are they likely to be? I know it's guesswork, but what are they likely to
It is guesswork at this stage, and I believe that the government are currently looking at, or from what we've heard, that they would need to obviously put right in terms of the members that weren't allowed to stay on the pensions that they were for some sort of pension credit, if there's a detriment, to be applied to their current pension in order to equalise the discrimination that they would have suffered. But it would need actuaries to evaluate that, and there could be slightly, some other complications in terms of, particularly as I've referred to with regards to low pay increases, about how much those two amounts would have deviated. But we'll have to see whether we get there, but that might be the slight complications with regards to that. But I think the simplest way that they would look to do it is via some form of pension credit. However, that does lead to another question, which is, what will government's opinion be to public sector pension schemes going forward with regards to that, which is of great concern to trade unions and their members. So it's something that we're watching very closely, because what we've seen in recent years, what we win with one hand, the government come back and look to take with another.
Yeah.
I guess one final question within that. Sorry, Terry, I realise I've
yes, you have
so many questions. So one kind of final question within there is because it's not just the benefit; it's also the age. In terms of early retirement schemes were age 60, 2015 67. Will that be affected?
It's unclear. I can't give any indication whether that will be part of the debate or not. I suggest that trade unions may want to make that part of the debate on behalf of their members. There'll be particularly some occupations where it's very relevant. It's relevant to all of them, of course, but particularly in ones that have had historical low ages based on the nature of the occupation. My view is that government wouldn't want to go anywhere near it, and would look for a clear-cut way on a financial basis and a pension credit way, and then would then look to adopt, perhaps pushing other people onto the current rules and schemes, which would make many other members very dissatisfied, and would have to work out what our approach would be to that, because there could be an argument that they could be losing out.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry to go.
Can I ask a bit more about the issues that you were talking about last time we met, which was the pension ombudsman's decision? Because not everybody knows about the pension ombudsman, and it was very helpful when they made a decision about. I think it was Regulation 14 was being misused by the Pensions Agency, and they upheld a complaint. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah.
I've had a number of requests from psychologists saying that they're being given extra hoops to jump, and the ombudsman found that was indeed the case.
Yep, sure. And it's obviously referring to mental health officer status, where we were discussing that before in terms of what that is. As you know very well, Terry, you supported many members in very sort of successful attempts to maintain and reverse decisions over the years with regards to that. So what is mental health officer status? Well, it's something that doesn't exist anymore in terms of it was stopped in 1995, but what was it? For new entrants. And it was something that was given based on the nature of the work that a member did in terms of if they were working with mental health patients, and the effects that had on them meant that they were allowed in their pension to retire at an earlier age, 55, and what that meant was that they would accrue at double the rate that they normally would, so they wouldn't be disadvantaged, so they'll get the full pension at an earlier age. It's been stopped for new starters now going forward as of that date, but as it is, and with it the sort of time period, it's become very, very topical because of the nature of the people's ages that they're coming to a time in life when they're looking at retirement and consider it, and they're asking questions, and some are finding that they're not liking the answers they're getting back with regards to mental health officer status or special class status, which is similar but was granted for different reasons, as we talked earlier with regards to nurses getting that for bad back and a very high physical level of job and the stresses that had on the body, both physical and mentally. So we're seeing a very big focus on that, and we're seeing it feels like a clampdown in some respects with regards to how that's being handled. So ourselves, our union, many other unions in the health sector are trying to support members best we can through lots of appeals. Some we've been successful with, some we haven't, in terms of a much more tighter process that it looks like that they are trying to implement. Now, this is based on legislation. However, there's another question in terms of there are guidelines out from the NHS pension scheme as an interpretation of those legislation. Now the debate comes, well, are they reflecting the law, and are they law? And this is when you refer to the Pensions Ombudsman case and that particular regulation, the question in effect that the Pension Ombudsman was asking based on a member's appeal with regards to their mental health officer status being turned down based on the employer, if you like, saying that they didn't fulfil the criteria and that certain assumptions have been made that they weren't necessarily around about 80% of the time had some form of physical or hands-on involvement in mental health. Now,
changing the standards.
Exactly, because the legislation is silent on in terms of the actual percentage, but it's become something that's become a sort of known or expected sort of standard within that. And also another one is, well, the hands-on part. That's not specifically mentioned within the legislation. However, there are guidelines stipulating that boxes literally must be ticked and what words must be in there, and it must be completed in a very particular type of way. And I know you've done a lot of good work over the years in terms of helping members and guiding them in filling it out correctly to make sure they're not disadvantaged in any way. And I think the focus we have seen is a much tighter form of criteria that they're using.
Well, also they're asking people to fill out forms over and over again, and apparently trying to apply those standards now that we have electronic patient records, which take a lot of time doing.
Yeah.
And applying an old standard from before computers, where you were supposed to be eyeball to eyeball with your clients. And not leave the room most of the time, which is they're incompatible, really. But I think there may be more than one regulation being bent slightly.
Well, in terms of the cases, they're all very different at times, and they can have their own little technicalities, but definitely the push is consistent in terms of the criteria. In terms of this 80% and the way they are adopting the regulation, I know that's being looked at and that's being challenged. And there is a potential challenge that's with the Pensions Ombudsman at the moment, that we're waiting to see what the determination is in that, which will give a more direct answer with regards to this debate about the guidelines. Are they legal or not? Are they in the true sense interpreting what the law says? But until we get an answer on that, it's a bit unclear to sort of direct members to say, well, it's definitely that. But in some cases, that may be a very useful element that we might be able to use.
It's not very transparent either, is it, to have a historically passed down level of standards that's never been confirmed or denied. It's interesting way of doing things.
It's very unsatisfactory and not transparent, and I think particularly now with the sort of age profile of members and the lack of communication, and then finding out that they'd believed for many years that they did have the status and it's been removed. It's been something's happened that hasn't, and they, I think there's a question also with regards to duty of care. And a failure there in terms of, beyond all the technical arguments, which I think is a debate in itself, which we will support the member in having those debates and fully exercising them and hopefully being successful. But beyond all that, there is a duty of care and responsibility on the employer, on the NHS pension scheme, to make sure that they have communicated them, because if not, and this is assuming that they're correct, where they may not be, but even if assuming they're correct, how can that member or individual have planned for their retirement? So there's another sort of major question there as well, which members need to be asking.
Yeah, there are a number of members who, when they were young, they weren't thinking about pensions, and nobody sat them down and explained it. Yeah, they weren't informed. It's a rule rather than the exception, I think.
Yeah.
I guess one particular question that seems to come up from a number of members is around the different projections and different amounts they might receive. There seems to be some inconsistencies in the way the different bodies are treating members. So, for example, some members are receiving projections for each pot they've been in. Others seem to be denied projections. Have you got any advice for those individuals? For example, one member was saying that they'd moved from the 1995 to the 2015 and weren't actually getting projections for each, really.
I'm aware of a lot of those frustrations, and members contacted me with regards to that. I think a lot of them have been brought about, again, through the changes from final salary to career average. And now final salary benefit statements they're all estimates, but a final salary one is obviously going to be brick close in terms of it's based on your final salary. So you know as of that date what figure to use. The difficulty comes with a career average in terms of no one really knows where that salary is going to be at the end. So this is a bit the government's excuse, if you like, because they can't predict and tell you exactly where that's going to be. So what they're doing is coming out with generic amounts and leaving the member with the task of trying to figure a lot of that out and apply a lot of the increases or everything to it. So it's not a very tailored and stroke accurate projection.
Quite a complicated process for members to kind of get their head around in order to do
it. It is, and it's unsatisfactory. And now I know on behalf of members in the civil service as well, we've complained to the civil servants service pension scheme. There's no need for, we can do that across the board for all the public sector schemes in terms of it not being satisfactory and the members wanting something that is more accurate. And the response we've had back so far is that they're not prepared to do anything at the moment with regards to it. It's too costly, it's too timely to provide very tailored individual accounts, and that's how they're defending it at the moment.
But that seems really inconsistent, because I know certain trusts are providing their employees with projections. You know, it's stipulated very clearly these are projections.
Yep.
But at least they're providing, you know, this is our guesstimate of where this pension might be at this time.
It certainly can be done, and it can certainly be done within a certain degree, like you say, protection. Nothing can be 100% right when it's a career average, because we don't know where to go. But you can provide something that is more accurate rather than providing nothing at all in terms of here's roughly where your final salary would be, but your career average, you know, go away, click this link, put in the figures yourself, come up and see what you come up with, and you know that isn't really satisfactory, is it? And you know, our members are rightly frustrated about that, and we'll continue to do all we can to change that, and to you know make sure members are finding out the information that they should have to make very, very important decisions on.
In regard to the final salary element, I know one question that's come up is in regard to actually where that final salary is. So, say for somebody like myself, you know, was it my final salary when I joined the 2015, or is it actually my final salary when I eventually retire?
Right. In terms of that, it will be the final salary you were on.
At the changeover?
Yes. And what normally happens is a revaluation amount is applied to the final salary. So if you've got X amount of years till you actually retire, it would increase by the revaluation amount, whatever that is in the scheme. In some schemes, it's the statutory minimum is CPI capped at 2.5%. The NHS and public sector schemes are a better form of revaluation. So it won't literally stay snapshot at that. No. It will still increase. However, you won't be able to get any further accrual, obviously, because that scheme is closed and you move into the new scheme.
Yeah, I think you've got a couple more questions that have been sent in at the back there.
Yeah, they'll hand you the list and we'll see.
You do one, I'll do one. Yeah, you can do the longer one.
I think one of these has been already been asked. Do you want to go for the shorter one when I just see
that one? That one hasn't. Right. Hi. I left the NHS to have my children and put my pension on hold. This is from Maureen. I went back to work within 5 years in 1994 as an RMN, but not for the NHS. I went to work in an ESMI nursing home, opened for patients, moved into the community when the local asylum closed. I then went from there back to the NHS in 2001. Should I still have my mental health officer status? I thought it was about working as an RMN rather than working for the NHS. Thank you for your help.
The 5-year question is one of the criteria that they would rule it out on, thank you. However, there are options that even if you're not working for an NHS employer as such, but you're still within that industry, that you may be able to make an application on that basis to appeal, because it sounds like the member's going to have to appeal that in order to say, well, look, I was still working in the same occupation. Obviously, it's a far stronger argument if it's an NHS employer, because then obviously you tick the box and they can't rule it out on their criteria. But there are options to appeal it.
There are.
Yeah.
So and that's the principle that mental health officer status was to protect against possible burnout, which was perceived as a problem.
Yeah, and again, I don't know the employer, but the employer may have been out at one point and in another point. That there may be some, there could be a bit further context that perhaps the member that might not be the case, but it could be. So it might be worth looking into that.
And the other point you've made is that if people weren't properly advised at the time, that they may have a legal case.
Well, I think I think it's an argument. I don't think it's necessarily the one that would win the day without the other elements being in there. But I think it's a question that and it is an obligation that they should answer.
For an employer?
Yeah.
And
an employer may go back to the NHS pension scheme and say, well, look, this is what we provided, they didn't come back to us. They might look to blame each other. The truth, who knows where that is? You'd have to follow the trail. But
because we're in clinical psychology, there's quite a lot of problem there's been quite a lot of problems when the pensions agency instead of asking the employer about whether clinical psychologists at the trainee stage, postgraduate trainees, were denied mental health officer status because they were regarded as part-time clinical workers, and part of the time they were at uni. And the pensions agency asked course directors, not employers, as their opinion on whether the trainees should have mental health officer status.
Yeah.
And the course director said no.
Yeah.
They were thinking about the uni element.
Yeah.
But
it was apply to student nurses over that period as well.
No. These are postgraduates. The equivalent would be junior doctors. They were discriminated against from the point at which the judgments came in that part-time workers should have mental health officer status.
On the basis that a lot of their training actually involved face-to-face kind of contact and working?
They were working at least 3 days a week in high-risk clinical situations.
I mean, for instance, purposes, that's not dissimilar to the situation student nurses at that time would have been in as well, because a majority of their training was actual work on the wards.
Yeah.
So
there is a parallel then.
Yeah,
perhaps.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And in that instance, they're obviously asking the wrong person
Yes.
As well, wasn't there?
Yeah,
First of all, they also gave the wrong answer in that example.
The answer should have been ask the employers.
Yeah. And to be fair to some employers, I won't say all, but to some employers, they can be helpful in this process because they know the worker, there's a long-term established relationship, they know the job that they've been doing, and they know that they should, in many of these situations, have this status and do what they can to support that. So it's quite important if a member does have a good relationship with the employer in that way, that they work together to make sure that they fulfil the criteria and jump through the hoops, particularly if we feel, sorry to use these analogies, another one, that the goalpost may have moved in some way. But if you do have that relationship where you're working with the employer to find the right way to reflect the actual role that you do in order to make sure you have the best opportunity either keeping that status, then that's very important, I think, in a lot of these situations, because we do see some appeals that are successful and some are not, and sometimes they don't look very dissimilar. Perhaps the support of the employer is the biggest difference in those situations.
Yes. You've got one more to read.
Yeah, I've got a couple here, but I think they've potentially been covered in some way. This is about drawdown.
Yep.
In terms of different ages. So I was given a second opinion during the choice exercise when the 2015 scheme was brought in. This was because I just missed out on mental health officer status and due to my age had no protection in the 1995 scheme. I changed my 1995 benefit to 2008 scheme to give me the option of drawdown after age 55. So I will have 20 years as of 2015 and 2008 scheme, and the rest in 2015 scheme, i.e. currently 4 years. Please can you tell me which pot or pots I can draw down on and how this is calculated?
I think that is the one we covered at the outset.
Yeah,
just briefly, yes, they can draw down against both pots, if you like. It's not a pot in terms of a defined benefit. A pot's naturally referred to in defined contribution schemes, but they can draw down on both schemes. And again, as I said at the beginning, in general, public sector workers within the pension schemes, the government rules out that you do not have a drawdown option. However, this is the only time or rule where a member would have that option when they've been denied that mental health officer status and they were given such choice, almost as a compensatory option, if you like.
Thank you. I think this one again is something we may have covered, as it's about whether people were given the right information. I have a question about NHS mental health officer status. I was in the NHS with mental health officer status from 1983 to 1993, then worked for my local authority as a nurse with people. I transferred my pension from NHS to the council pension with similar benefits. I stayed there until 2000 when I went back to the NHS working in mental health, where I've worked ever since. I'm rather confused in regard to the rules of re-entering mental health officer status. It was when I was a council employee that the rules changed, and I was never informed, so didn't move back in time. I've had all my service recognised by my current employer for the purposes of salary, leave, redundancy, etc. So I had hoped that I could reclaim my service as mental health officer status. As only 7 years of my 35 years were with the council, and I've worked in mental health ever since 1983, it seems unfair that I can't claim back some of it and retire with additional benefits. Can you please advise?
That one concerns me in terms of if it's reflected correctly in there. If the member did actually transfer out of the scheme into the council scheme, as it says there. Sometimes when you read things like that, that isn't actually what's happened. But if that is correct, then that would the member would have, perhaps done themselves some harm in terms of being able to access this option. The question I would ask is, what advice did they take? Yeah. Because, and looking at those dates, the laws probably weren't in place as strongly as they are now with regards to that. But generally, in any transfer situation now, if you've got more than 30,000 in your scheme, you have to take advice from an independent financial advisor. And if they were doing that and had assessed the NHS pension scheme, and if that member had mental health officer status and the option to potentially retire at 55 and get double accrual, even if that was left in a state of deferment for a 5-year period, they would have to assess that against the council's perhaps local government pension scheme offering. And you would expect them, if they were looking at, to say, well, look, if you're going to stay more than 5 years, you run the risk of losing this, and then, you may not want to transfer that out. I can't advise, but you may want to keep that deferred for that period of time. Yes, enter the council scheme, but you may also want to consider, if you don't go back within 5 years, you could be potentially, all things being correct, we may not have the full details there, but losing access to that option of mental health officer status. But I'd like to know, did the member actually physically transfer out? Because if they did, then
it's about the advice.
It will be about the advice they received. Did they take any advice? The members only come back really then is if they did take advice, then challenging that advice. And there are processes that you can go through in order to challenge that advice, which we can advise the member on in terms of what is the right way to do that. If they didn't take advice, then there's nowhere really to go with it as such.
Well, except we've got the duty of care point again, haven't we? It's the same as
what information they were given or not given.
The employer has it.
They could go potentially back to the NHS pension scheme and the trustees, you like, in terms of what advice they gave the member in terms of when they requested a transfer. But now it's a lot clearer than it would have been back then in terms of those dates, and there's more obligation, certainly on the trustees, to make sure that a member can't transfer out without taking the advice of the IFA. And then if the member in the current context does do that and goes against the IFA, the Independent Financial Advisors advice, then in effect they're waving goodbye to any sort of legal recourse with that.
So where should members go? I know that we've spoken about the importance of keeping the regional structure going, that people need to use their regional.
Yeah, with any pensions issues, the sort of protocol is to approach a regional officer first of all with any pension issues, and I'm sure many of the regional officers from that point will be able to service them and deal with that. If the regional officer needs any further support or guidance, they can come to me, obviously, and I provide that support to the regional officer, and from there the regional officer works with the member in terms of taking that forward.
And do they have to exhaust all processes with the pensions agency before they can go to the Ombudsman?
Yes, in terms of the process, for all pension schemes really, it's called an IDRP in terms of internal disputes resolution procedure, and the NHS pension scheme has it, as do all. There are 2 stages to that. So you apply in the first stage. If they turn down your appeal, it's a 2-stage appeal process. Then you have a second stage. Beyond that, the final recourse is, as you say, Terry, to the Pensions Ombudsman. So that is the standard formal structure that's in all pension schemes about any query to do with pensions, not just mental health officer status, but any query that you may have. Just
remind us again, what does IDRP stand for?
It's the Internal Disputes Resolution Procedure, and the NHS pension scheme has a IDRP process as well for you to follow, and again 2-stage appeal with final recourse to the Pensions Ombudsman. But particularly with mental health officer status, there's a form to fill in, isn't there, and sort of criteria, and it's very rigid now in terms of trying to express and tight in terms of being able to get over what you actually do. But a key part of that is, again, not defined in the regulations, but this sort of belief standard around roughly 80%, somewhere around there in terms of a hand-on role. So it's being able to reflect that is very key and important.
Yeah, so 85%, I think.
Yeah.
Eyeball to eyeball.
Yeah. But then there's different ways that eyeball to eyeball patient care can be done. So members mustn't naturally assume that certain administrative roles, for instance, don't count. But you need to be able to represent that, and if you don't, and you don't hit this sort of criteria that we know is not defined in the law, but is the one that they're judging it by, then they're going to rule you out.
And again, if people want advice on this, they can go to their local representative, and if they need to kind of escalate that, they can kind of come through you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, no worries.
Thank you very much for your time in answering all the questions.
You're welcome.
Brilliant. Now, that's the end of today's session. I just want to say thanks to Terry, Jonathan and John for doing today's session. It's going to be available online forever until the internet doesn't exist anymore. So if you want to look again at any of the points that have been raised, listen to any of the answers, then do visit us on Facebook. It will also be on our YouTube channel later, maybe not today, but in the next few days. Thank you to everyone that's taken the time to watch today. Please do keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages because we try to do events like this on a relatively frequent basis, just so we can keep members up to date with issues that interest them. And if there is an issue that you want us to cover, then do get in touch. You can either do that by email or if you want to tweet me at David A. Monday. The last message that I want to give today is that we are the first Thursday in May today, so that means voting day. If you've not already visited the polls, then please do go and put your cross in the box and have a great rest of the day. Thanks, guys.